Hello, this is the RPG Pundit, the final boss and internet shitlords, and today I am filming outside, as you can see. I'm sure a lot of you have been, I know a lot of you have been complaining about the lack of meatball in recent videos. Well, here she is, happy as usual outside. I'm also filming outside because I'm doing some more repair work on the house. See, one of the things that you have to know if you become a homeowner is that, like, you know, I've bought a house, it's completely paid off. But you're always going to be spending money on repairs of the house. That's just the reality of it. And especially if you're in my situation. Oh, look at that jump. Pretty good for an almost 14-year-old kitty. If you're in my situation where you're a owner of a house that's over 100 years old, there's always going to be something to do. Meatball, are you eating the neighbor's vegetables there? Neighbor's plants. Look at that. Look at her munching on those plants. All right. So today, before anything else, I'll comment on that the newest issue of the Pundit Files is out. You can buy it only at the Red Room. There will be a link in the description below. And this current issue, number 4, is called Fast NPC Generation. And it's a bunch of guidelines and random tables that allow you to deal with that not too unusual situation where you've got just, you know, like there's just some guy, I don't know, a waiter or, you know, some dude at a market or some random guard. And for some reason, the PCs decide to invest much more time on him than you thought they would. So all you had was like guard and you didn't even think of anything else. Like, weren't expecting him to last more than half a second of role play. And then suddenly they want his life story or something. So this lets you quickly generate NPCs with just a couple of roles that will have their own, you know, you can determine what their level is, whether they're, you know, their abilities, their appearance, their quirks, their interests, and potential plot devices. In those situations that all DMs know about, when some guy that you thought was just going to be there for a moment, suddenly the player characters decide to adopt him, or any other situation where you have to just quickly generate NPCs. Meatball thinks that these are like, I think she thinks this is furniture. You know, she likes to sit in this pot in particular. So that's it. Check it out in the Red Room store, and check out all my other products. If you want more fantastic random generators of all kinds that you can use for tons of stuff, check out the Gonzo Fantasy Companion, which you can get through drive-through, just so we balance things out a bit there. Okay, so the topic I was going to do today is based on some people have been asking me about what I would advise for the creation of settings. And the thing is, this would not be, if I did this in one video, like gave you all the advice on making a setting, it would probably have to be, I don't know, like a 6-hour marathon live stream or something. So instead, I'm going to go a little bit piece by piece. So I'm going to be doing, I'll probably do some more of these later on, depending on how many views it gets, how much people like it, if they share it, etc. Because remember, always the stuff, I get tons of people here who say that they really like it when I'm giving DM advice instead of talking about controversies. And speaking of controversies, by now, there should be a live video out unless it goes wrong. I haven't done it yet, but I'm going to do it later today. But there should be a live video out on Twitter, on my X rather, which you can find the link in the description below, that is going to be about how Critical Role allowed itself to be bullied into, essentially supporting Hamas, right? But you'll have to get the details on my Twitter by now. Hopefully, it should be somewhere on my Twitter feed there, and you'll have to look it up. But stuff like that, talking about controversy. I didn't do that one on YouTube just because I figure that Twitter is more open to free speech, so I decided to do it there. But I do a lot of videos here criticizing WotC or other stuff like that, and a lot of you diehard fans say you like the DM advice part better, and okay, that's great, right? Except that, like, if you're saying that, well, you've got to help support it, because the videos I do with DMing advice or reviews never get as many views as the ones where I'm, talking about the latest WotC screw up, So support it, right? So today what I'm going to talk about with regards to creating setting is, I think, probably one of the things that are most often missed by setting creators. Meatball is exploring the neighbor's window. She's often, when she was younger anyways, I don't know if she might do it now. You never know. She probably still does it, but she's just sneakier about it. She used to just climb right through that window. And that's not my house. That's my neighbor's house, right? Right now, there's no one home because they're doing talking about repair. They're doing whole renovations there, right? But, she would just hang out there, and every once in a while, my neighbor, she would see Meatball inside her house. And luckily, she didn't mind because, it wasn't a big deal to her. But anyway, so to me, the biggest thing that is missed in the creation of setting, and this is people have asked about, I'm presuming here, if you're trying to make a setting book, okay? But it can also apply very much if you're trying to make a new campaign, like a homebrew, right? So lots of people will know, okay, well, you got to have a map, you got to have geography, you have to know where things are, you have to have a story about it, so those are all very basic things. But I think that the thing, and I'm going to later on, I'm going to talk about the right ways to do a lot of those things, I hope, in future videos. But I think that the thing people miss the most, and we see this in tons of published books too, is that if you're going to have a successful setting, whether it's your campaign or whether it's a published book, one of the things you have to make sure is that the people playing it, or potentially running it if you're making a setting book, have to understand what the fundamental paradigm of that world is. That's essential. Okay. So a lot of times, a lot of setting books have introduction or something like that. And a lot of gamers, myself included, in a lot of these cases will just skim right past that, right? They'll just ignore it, because most of the time those introductions are pretty much useless, right? They're just talking about the Forgotten Realms is an ancient land and blah, 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 right? But I would advise anyone who gets one of my setting books never to skip the introduction. Because in the introduction, unless you've read the same thing before, but my introductions to my setting books, like Dark Albion, I even put it in Lion and Dragon. Lion and Dragon isn't a setting, it's a rule book, but it's a rule book that is made to emulate a specific type of setting, which is a medieval authentic world, right? So the thing that I put there first, in front of everything, is the assumptions that every DM should know is what guides the world, and the assumptions that every player should be told and should understand this is how the world works, okay? One of the big things about D&D settings or OSR settings or whatever you want to call them is that a ton of them are basically just generic, right? They're basically what I call fun time Renaissance fair land, right? American Renaissance fair setting. So it's people in old-timey dress, but everybody acts like it's 2024, right? Or at least it's, 1985 or whatever, right? They have the values, behaviors, attitudes, speech, social construction, political ideas of the postmodern world, or at least the modern world, only, and the medieval part is only trappings, right? It's only a facade. And those are incredibly boring settings, in my opinion, right? Fine. I mean, a lot of people can say, well, I just want to have generic fantasy world. Okay, you can, right? But there's tons of generic fantasy worlds. Basically almost every setting ever devised for official D&D is generic fantasy world, right? And you can do that with your setting too. But I mean, if you're doing a setting book that is generic fantasy world, then you're really going to have to think about, what will make that world more interesting for someone to buy and read and play than if they just run the world in the Forgotten Realms, right? Because that's what you're competing against. You're competing against the really well-known, very successful generic fantasy world. Someone who buys your book presumably either doesn't want to run their own homebrew or wants to take inspiration from your stuff. So what inspiration would you be giving him and what would make your generic fantasy world better than just, buying, if they were to buy, say, the original Forgotten Realms set, or, take your pick of which Greyhawk set. Personally, I think From the Ashes is the best one, but I know that I'm really in the minority there. Or, the Mystara Gazetteers, right? Like, all of those are generic fantasy world. Dragonlands too. It's generic fantasy world with a hint of Tolkien, a bit of extra Tolkien and a hint of Mormonism. It's just, you've got to be able to then have something that stands out, and something like, orcs in this setting are furry is not standing out. It's just trappings again. You have to have something fundamental that is going to be different. So in a lot of cases, what you can do that would be fundamentally different would be the paradigm, and so you could say, well, this is a generic fantasy world, but it is, Middle Eastern or based on the Incas or something. Well, okay. So is it though, or is it just the trappings? Because if you say, so the names and the dress that people have and maybe the gods are all Incan, let's say, but everybody still acts like it's 2024, and you still have the same kind of like, there's no real importance about things like social class. There's not a lot of emphasis on the particular religious values of the Inca people or anything like that. It's just, guys that are from the American Midwest or from, the West Coast or wherever, hanging out in a coffee shop in Inca land, right? then you haven't really added all that much to the equation. I mean, it might just be enough because it's like a very big superficial difference. Like, I mean, if you really don't want to involve a cultural paradigm in your setting, then you're going to have to make sure that the appearance, that if all you want is to change the superficial trappings, then you've got to go all in. You got to do it really big. So at least there are people who are just looking for a different skin suit for their setting, for their generic fantasy world, will find it sufficiently different from, say, the Forgotten Realms or Greyhawk, right? Because if your homebrew setting, you might be really proud of it. You might have run a campaign of it for 20 years, and that's great. But if it's still basically just generic fantasy with 20th century values or 21st century values or whatever, and it doesn't really look visually, it's still guys in plate mail, and they've got, kind of vaguely medievalish Renaissance dress, and there's nothing particularly special that makes it different. If you're talking about writing a book, I would warn you that you'd face some very stiff competition, and it would be really questionable how much sales you'd get. So if you're doing it as a labor of love, you just want to show off your campaign, well, great, right? But if you're talking about how to design it in a way that's going to be capable of making an impact, that's different. And so if you want it to be really different, the main thing you have to change is the paradigm. So the paradigm, what I mean by that is a set of concepts that the people living in the society take to be real. Okay, every different societies have different fundamental paradigms, which are the way that they understand the world, right? The way that they look at the world. So like, obviously, even in the same time frame, in the same time, like in the present age, the paradigm from which somebody in the United States or in France views the world, there might be slight differences in their paradigms even, but generally their paradigm is going to be quite similar versus the paradigm of somebody who lives in, let's say, Indonesia. Okay, there's going to be very significant views that are changed there, even in a world as globalist as ours, because the Indonesian guy is going to have had filtered down elements of the Western paradigm that will reach him and that he will now take as fundamental reality. But he's also got a bunch of stuff from his own culture that is still there that would seem quite alien to someone from, let's say, Omaha, right? And that's to say nothing of the paradigm of someone living in the mountains of Afghanistan, or a desert tribesman in the in somewhere in Africa, right? So these are worldviews, okay? And the worldviews can matter a lot more in a pre-modern setting than they would in a modernist or postmodern setting, right? Because modernism tends well, at least in the one example we have, there's only been one modern civilization ever, which is the Western civilization. But then it went and basically spread that concept to the rest of the world. And so from what we see, modernism tends to create globalism, right? Because modernism allows the spread of, it creates such an enormous difference in the quality. Like before the modern world, all societies that were pre-modern were roughly equal in terms of their capabilities and in terms of their values, right? Like there were differences, of course. You could say that some societies were better than others, right? I mean, you could argue that the Renaissance era Christian civilization of Europe had some things that were certainly better in terms of humanism than the Aztecs, let's say. But fundamentally, there was a lot more. They're on a much more even plane, right? Both in terms of technology and both in terms of social ideas and everything else. But the Industrial Revolution combined with the modernist concepts that revolutionized the way society worked, created an enormous imbalance, right? There, all of a sudden, the West was objectively superior in almost every sense. And so its ideas, because it's not just about, people that talk about stuff like colonialism or something. It wasn't that it doesn't actually matter if they conquered a place or not. Even the places they didn't conquer received the ideas, because these work paradigms are like a mind virus, right? Like actually the word meme originates from an idea of Richard Dawkins, where he points out that ideas work in a viral form, right? And so the concepts that made the West successful, many places that were never colonized by the West also adopted those concepts because they saw the success in it. Whereas in the pre-modern world, the differences are going to be more notable because that kind of spread doesn't happen, right? Like there are ideas do spread and have spread throughout history from all sorts of different places, but you don't end up having you end up having a situation where there are things that spread and then there's stuff that stays fundamentally different, and so the possibility of culture clash is much higher, right? So essentially what you have to create in a setting is you have to figure out a list of what are the things that make playing a character in the setting very different from being yourself in the modern world, right? And so in an example with Lion and Dragon, I point out some of these most fundamental things, or Dark Albion, and it's going to be in Baptism of Fire too. In all of my medieval authentic games, Sword and Caravan, I point out that if you're playing in this game, if you're the DM, you need to make sure that these things are happening in the game if you want the game to have the full experience, right? I mean, obviously somebody doesn't necessarily have to. Someone could just skip all that and say, well, it's like, yeah, we're playing in the Third Crusade, but it's actually, everybody thinks and acts like, somebody from the 21st century. That would be really weird, right? But a lot of people probably do that. And in a ton of games, you see that happening, right? Like in the Forgotten Realms, you see that happening all the time. But if you want to make it work in a way that is going to make it stand out, first you have to make sure that the people that are going to read your setting understand what values you think by default should be what the DM presents as the world, and what players have to understand that they have to live in the world. So in Lion and Dragon, I talk about the monotheistic concept, right? Like that's a big one. And a while earlier, it might not have been as big of a big one, but we basically live in a post-God world, in the post-modernist world. So our society is only still monotheistic in the sense of like a fossil of monotheism that continues to hold on, but is essentially no longer, like people in the modern West don't really believe, right? Like there isn't. There are a few people who still believe, right? But as a society, that belief is not actually reflected in the way we act. right? So you have to emphasize, okay, this is a world where everybody believes in God. You know, some people might hate God, they might resent God, they might serve demons or something like that, or they might live a life of sin and just accept that they're going to hell or something like that. But they all believe in it, right? And that is a fundamental part of the setting, right? And so the religion is seen as something absolutely real. Magic is seen as something absolutely real, and it has enormous emphasis on people because faith is a matter of tremendous significance, right? So you can see this in some other societies where you have people who, like, there are lots of people who are like, let's say in India, for example, there's tons of people in India that have very modern or postmodern lives, but they aren't especially religious. They were born Hindu the same way somebody in the West might be born Catholic or Baptist or something like that, but they don't attend the temple. They don't do any of this stuff, right? Like they're Diwali Hindus. It's like somebody might be a Christmas Catholic, right? When some guy comes in who's a sadhu or something, well, they give a token of respect, right? Because it's still, the instinct is still there to do that, right? Stuff like that, and having that religiosity be a big part of the setting makes it very different than if it's like, like in the default fantasy settings where you have, clerics are there to heal you and there are temples there, but it's, there isn't any emphasis on role-playing faith. And also it's a polytheistic world, which makes no sense for medieval authentic settings, for medieval what they call medieval fantasy, but there's all these different gods. And they don't even work the way paganism actually worked, right? So like it's actually like a serial monotheism where everybody just happens to believe that all the other gods are there, but you basically only choose one. Like, it's really weird, right? How D&D deities turned out to be. Another thing is social class, right? Like you have to decide, how do the social classes work? What are they? Is there a really strict caste structure? Like you're born into one thing and that's all you can possibly be? Is there social mobility? How do different classes get to relate to each other? Like, do they get to, does someone who's basically a peasant have to do anything that a priest or a noble tells them to? Or are they allowed to question them? Or is it only under certain circumstances? You got to think all that through. What are the social roles? Because our society has almost no social roles, right? It's basically in the postmodern, even in the modernist West, there is this presumption of equality, right? That means that there is no deference given to someone by the status of their birth as a rule. I mean, a little bit you still see in some of the English monarchies, but even there, like, I'm pretty sure that if Prince William told someone to shine his boots, that unless it was his official royal boot shiner or something, there'd be a large percentage of English people would tell him to F off, right? So, that social class distinction doesn't exist, right? There are differences in how people in different social classes behave right now, which is another bit, but it was much bigger back then, right? Like you'll in Baptism of Fire, for example, the Polish aristocracy, the Slacha, interestingly enough, there was less of a sense of social class division in Poland than in more Western European countries, in that there was an understanding of, because unlike many of the other Western countries, the Polish aristocracy were actually Poles, right? It wasn't like the Normans who came in and conquered the Anglo-Saxons, etc. So it was a bit more homogenous. But the way they acted and the cultures, and there was this whole culture, Sarmatism, that essentially was a totally different set of social behaviors than what the commoners did, right? So they might have their own like subculture, right, and their own rules, So you've got to think about that. You got to think about what's the role of women, right? Or what's, what's understood as the education, how children are perceived, right? What weird cultural traits they might have in general about, different things that would stand out compared to our society. So these are all concepts that you need to kind of keep in mind, and presenting those paradigm concepts ends up providing a really strong start to creating a setting that is going to be really unique. Just one sec. The only issue with filming in the alleyway. All right. So I think that's basically what I wanted to start out with, because that's the part that most designers miss, is figure out a list of all the things that would be different for a typical person in terms of what they believe and how they're expected to behave from how a person in 21st century America is to believe and how to behave, right? And those differences, you then want to emphasize that in some kind of place where it'll be presented to the potential DM and the potential players, and then it needs to be continually emphasized within the descriptive parts of the of the setting, right? Within the gazetteer, within the if you have a section on NPCs, if you have a section on government or things like that, all of that. So if you do that, then you're going to take a massive step towards making your setting more unique, and therefore having a chance of standing out against a large mass of settings that are essentially all, they might have some different visual elements or what have you, but they're essentially all playing the same kind of generic fantasy. So I guess that's everything for today. If you like this video, please share it. Again, if you want me to do more stuff like this, then help make sure that it gets the views that'll encourage me to do more of this and less griping about wizards or something like that. And like the video, subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Make sure that by subscribing, you get more access to community posts of Meatball that you don't want to miss, and shorts and things like that. So that way you get the notification bell, right? That way you'll always be informed when I put up another picture of Meatball here. If you haven't seen the post section of my YouTube, you want to check it out because it's full of Meatball pics. And share everything and check out all of my products. The links to my books are in the description below. If you want to get some interesting settings, all of my settings have that kind of conceptual design to them. Well, technically, the Invisible College doesn't, because the Invisible College is set in our modern world, so characters there, but all of the other ones do. So be sure to check them all out. Currently smoking, well, actually finished smoking before I started this video, a Stanwell Deluxe plus Argento Natural.